Welcome everybody. In this video, we are going to follow up on some discussions we've been having about the American Society of Addiction Medicine criteria, specifically on Dimension 5, which is about continued use and relapse potential. And today we're going to focus in on what we call relapse triggers, internal and external. So let me share my screen with you here, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Sometimes relapse triggers can be confusing for people. They don't really understand what it means. But essentially, a relapse trigger is something that makes us want to drink or use when we are perhaps otherwise wanting to abstain. And so there's generally two types of relapse triggers, internal and external. So an internal relapse trigger is something that comes from inside of us. So these are thoughts or cognitions or feelings, emotions that can be triggers to drink or use. So examples would be when I feel depressed, it makes me want to drink. When I feel angry at my partner, I want to use. When I think about past abuse I've experienced, it makes me want to escape and drink or use. Or when I'm getting into a pattern of negative thoughts or I'm ruminating, that generally leads me to want to drink or use. So these are relapse triggers that are kind of coming from within. External relapse triggers are, if you're familiar with AA, they will say people, places, and things. But another way to think about that would be external relapse triggers are things that you observe with your five senses. So things you hear, smell, taste, touch, or see. So some examples with this would be seeing alcohol, especially seeing alcohol in my home. But it could be seeing alcohol on an ad on TV or in a magazine. It could be seeing somebody else drink alcohol. It could be hearing ice cubes being dropped into a glass. That could be a relapse trigger. Being inside of a bar is one that comes up a lot. And if you think about that, it makes perfect sense that this would be a big external relapse trigger for people. If you are sitting in a bar, then you have many, many external relapse triggers happening all at once. Your five senses are overwhelmed with relapse triggers. You're really being bombarded by things that you are seeing. So you're seeing a wall of alcohol. You're seeing other people drinking alcohol. You are hearing all of the sounds of the bartender making the drinks. You're hearing all the sounds of people consuming the drinks. If you are partaking, then you're tasting the drink, but maybe you are just having a snack at the bar. That too could be a external relapse trigger if you used to drink and have that snack together. The feel of the bar stool underneath you, the feel of the bar in front of you, the feeling of holding a glass. So it can get very detailed, and there's just a million possible external relapse triggers in that environment. So when I have a client tell me, "Oh, I can go to a bar and I'm not triggered," it's not that I think they're lying to me, but I know that there are far too many triggers in that environment for it to not be triggering. I believe that they don't want to be triggered. However, I sincerely believe that. But there's just too much going on there for your brain to not recognize it. And so this is an important part here, is recognizing our brains are stimulated by external relapse triggers before we even realize what's going on. It is a very quick, automatic process happening that we don't have a lot of control over. So could somebody who is trying to abstain from alcohol because they have a problem with alcohol, could they go to a bar and possibly not drink? The answer is yes, they certainly could. However, they would be triggered. Even if they had no intention of drinking, their brain is picking up on all of these external relapse triggers. That's not because they're doing it wrong. That's just because that's what our brains do when our brains have an addiction to a substance. So it's really important for clients to understand and be able to name what are the internal relapse triggers that they have and what are the external relapse triggers that they have, to be able to identify kind of what are their top 5, or if there's a lot of them, what are the top 10 internal and external relapse triggers that they experience. And they need to make a plan for what are they going to do when these triggers pop up. The initial impulse will be to drink or use. Again, not because that is their intention, but because that is the set pattern in their brain. That is the natural course of action that their brain pulls them to. So if they want to do something different, they're going to have a plan for what to do when they get triggered, either internally or externally. So for example, if I have a client who comes in and says, I notice that when I become sad and I start to feel depression coming on, my urge to drink grows exponentially, and I usually end up drinking. That is so fantastic that they can identify that is their behavioral pattern. And we can have a lot of validation for what they're experiencing. It makes sense that if they are experiencing a lot of sadness or depression, that's very painful. And yes, it makes sense they would want that feeling to go away. That doesn't mean that they're bad. That means they're human. So we can give them a lot of validation there. It makes sense that you would have thoughts of drinking when you experience those uncomfortable emotions. However, they might identify, well, initially I feel better when I drink, but then things tend to get worse and I end up thinking about hurting myself, or I end up drinking and driving, or I end up doing or saying things that I regret. Right there, those are really wonderful motivators to find some different solutions to feeling that sadness and depression that will prevent them from having more difficulties brought on by drinking. So you can do a lot of validation of that entire process and really praise them for wanting to try something different. But if you want something different to happen, you need to have a better plan. So what I encourage clients to do is to spend some time thinking about, what are my main triggers? What are my main internal relapse triggers? What are my main external relapse triggers? And I want them to write them down. And I want them to bring them into the session, either an individual session, or if they're comfortable, a group session is fine too. And have them talk about what goes on for them and why are these triggers? And to start brainstorming, what can they do differently when they notice these triggers coming on? That process is not a one-time process. Understanding your internal and external relapse triggers is a process that you will be learning throughout your recovery. It will always be there. You will always be learning more about what triggers you and what's the best way for you individually to handle it. And so therapists and counselors can be there right alongside the client, helping them navigate it when they realize, oh, here's another trigger that I really didn't understand before. And you can be there to help with this process over and over again. It's important for a therapist to realize that clients will not always make it through a trigger without drinking or using. But if they can come back after the incident and process what happened and identify a better plan, then that can really help them succeed next time. Taking it back a few steps though, ultimately, we also want to work with our clients on how can they prevent internal and external relapse triggers. And that's also a very fruitful and a very long ongoing discussion of, it seems like you tend to find yourself inside a bar and then you get really triggered and you drink. What can we do about that? And starting to focus in on life situations that can be very triggering. Or maybe as a therapist, you notice a pattern of every time your client goes to visit their mother, they drink that night. So that could be a mixture of internal or external relapse triggers, but it's a pattern. And those patterns are really important to understand to help people eventually figure out how they can be clean and sober long term. So, speaking of a collision of internal and external, in my experience, I have found that people who really want to be clean and sober, they can work on their triggers and get through a lot of them, even with limited recovery experience. If they recognize they're being triggered, even if they panic, they can sometimes find their way out of it. But when you start combining internal relapse triggers and external relapse triggers at the same time, that is when the probability of relapse goes way up. So let me talk about an example of that. Let's say I'm that person that every time I visit my mom, it seems like I want to drink. And so maybe my mixture going on there is maybe I have the internal relapse trigger of I have a very conflictual relationship with my mother, and it's very complicated and very emotional, and it's exhausting. And that is my internal trigger, is I feel angry and I feel depressed and irritated, and those emotions make me want to drink. And so then if I come home and there's a bottle of wine on my kitchen counter, boom, there's the external relapse trigger. And now I've just mixed them. Now I have the internal relapse triggers happening, and I haven't done anything to address those from visiting my mom's house. And then I have the external relapse trigger of the bottle of wine on my counter. And those two types of triggers together have a very high likelihood of leading me to relapse. So that's another item to really talk with your clients about, is not only how do we recognize these triggers, how do we make plans for these triggers, how do we try to steer clear of the triggers that we can, what's the plan for when we see two of these different triggers come together and combine. We have the internal and the external combining. We need to have a really solid plan for what we do in that situation to keep ourselves safe. So I hope that this video was helpful to you. Just another way of looking at internal and external relapse triggers. It's a great opportunity to work with your client in a non-shaming way about problem solving around their relapse potential. If you do really great work in this dimension, more importantly, if your client does really great work in this dimension, it can really lower their risk for relapse potential in Dimension 5 of BA-SAM. It also gives you a great opportunity to talk about past relapse experiences and using some solution-focused concepts when you discuss past relapses with your clients to figure out maybe some things that worked previously that they could do again to help themselves. So don't forget to add that too, that your clients may have some answers that you can tap into to help them on their journey of recovery. If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. And if you have other questions about upcoming continuing education courses or clinical resources, you can visit our website at pacificcrestclinical.com. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.